Hello, my name is Jason Braz. I'm an Integration Squad developer and I would like to welcome you to the With You With Me team. This lesson is an introduction to URI, query and header parameters in relation to their importance with MuleSoft. Having a sound understanding of these concepts is essential to becoming a MuleSoft Certified Developer. This lesson is designed to complement MuleSoft's Anypoint Platform Development Fundamentals course and be used as study material for the exam. During the lesson, I will explain the different parameter methods as they relate to the MuleSoft environment. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to have a basic understanding of the client and host relationship with the client sending a HTTP request. You'll understand the terms URI, URL, and URN. And I'll go into the different types of parameters such as a URI parameter, a query parameter, and then header parameters. But let's first get into some of the basics. In this screen, you can see the client initiates a query by sending a HTTP request to a host in order to receive a desired response. The request will include a URI of the resource and may include additional parameters. The host receives and processes the request, then replies to the client, sending a HTTP response along with a status code. A HTTP request is initiated by the client to a host server. The aim of the request is to access a resource on the server. HTTP requests are sent via a predetermined method such as a GET or a POST. And the HTTP request may use one or a combination of URI, query, or header parameters. We'll break these down in the following slides. We'll start with the URI parameter. But first, let's take a look at what a URI is. The Uniform Resource Identifier, or URI, is a unique sequence of characters that identifies a resource. A URI does this by using either a location, a name, or both. The URI is further categorized as either a Uniform Resource Locator or a Uniform Resource Name. The Uniform Resource Locator, or URL, specifies a web resource by its location on a computer network and a protocol for retrieving it. Don't worry too much about this yet, as we'll break down the URL in the next slide. The URN uses a URN schema. It's beyond the scope of MuleSoft, so we'll only focus on the URL here on. Okay, so here is a typical URL for an API where a URI parameter is utilized. The structure is formatted as a GET request where the URI parameter values are bound within the URL. There is no reference to a key in the URL, so let's see how this works. Breaking down the URL into its individual components, we can see HTTPS sets the protocol to be used. Since HTTPS is the preferred MuleSoft protocol, all examples will use HTTPS. Next, we get to the host name. This is typically a domain name, a fixed IP address, or a host name. Next is the port number, and they are not often required as the protocol will define a port number by default. For example, HTTPS uses the port 443, HTTP uses port 80, FTP uses port 21, and in default connectors for MuleSoft, we use port 8081. The host location and port number combine to identify the remote host and the port it is listening on. All remaining information in the URI relates to the API endpoint and any parameters needed to be passed. Next in the URI is a directory, or also known as a folder. In our case, this is the first part of the API endpoint. Finally, we have the value of a key-value pair. In the YAML file, this will be presented as the key in curly brackets. But don't stress, we're about to look at how these query parameters work under the bonnet, including header parameters that are not representative by a simple URL or URI. Okay, so here's a typical URL for an API where a query parameter is utilized. The structure is formatted as a GET request where the query parameters are bound within the URL. As with the previous slide, HTTPS sets the protocol to be used. Next we go to the host address and the optional port number. Next is the directory, or the first part of our API endpoint. The flights component provides the next level of the expected API endpoint. Finally, we have the query string itself. The query string appears at the end of the URL and commences with the question mark. After the question mark, the query string should be followed with key value pairs, where the key, in this case a destination airport, is separated by its value with an equal sign. With this example, we are looking for flights with a destination of San Francisco, or SFO. In summary, for a URI parameter, these appear as part of the API endpoint and commence with a backslash. For the example, we are providing the parameter of a flight ID of 1234 to the URI. They can appear at the end of an endpoint in this example or between API endpoints. They accept a value for a known key position within the URI, where the API has a key placeholder. And they are suitable for required parameters, specific records, or a group of records. Now to summarize query parameters. In the example here, we're using the get method to retrieve all flights with a destination SFO, or San Francisco. The query parameters always appear at the end of the API endpoint and commence with a question mark. They use key value pairs in the format key equals value. Our key here is destination and the value is SFO. Extra key value pairs can be added, separated by an ampersand. And query parameters are best suited for optional parameters, filtering and sorting. We see typical RAML file with content on the left. In the URI parameter example, we can create the start of the endpoint with \flights. Then the final part of the endpoint takes on the ID. Where the curly brackets exist, this is a placeholder for an ID field. In this case, it would be a flight ID. Here we see the full key value pair, where the key is named as the placeholder in the RAML file and the value is provided in the URI. To access a URI parameter, simply use the attributes.URIParams.keyname, or in this case ID, as shown to the right. In the query parameter example, we have an API endpoint /flights. From that, we attach a query string by starting with a question mark. For query parameters, we see the full key value pair. As above, destination is the key and SFO is the value. Within the RAML file, we create the API endpoint /flights. Then for get method, we provide a destination key for the query parameter, further defining this as a string type. To access the query parameter, simply use the attributes.queryparams.keyname, in this case destination, as shown to the right. Finally, we have header parameters. These do not affect a URI and are actually sent as additional information with a HTTP request or HTTP response. However, you can cater for these in a RAML file and retrieve their values. In the RAML file, header parameters must be set under traits, and a value type is required. In this case, we are simply requesting the client ID and client secret as a string type value. Equally, the values can be retrieved using attributes.headers.keyname, in this case client ID, as pictured. Which method to use for passing key value pairs to an API may be considered as following. For URI parameters, to retrieve a specific record, say a flight number, or a set of records. They're also handy where a parameter may be required. For instance, an account lookup may require an account ID. For query parameters, may be used to filter a set of records by a matched field. For example, we may want to see all flights that are heading to San Francisco. Query parameters may also be used to sort a set of records by a field value. For instance, I may want to buy the cheapest ticket, so sorting them by price will make this task easier. And where a parameter is optional, maybe you don't need to sort by price or don't care where the flight is going, you just want to get away. The header parameters, these are typically used for authentication and validation, but can also be used for any key value pair scenario in place of query and header parameters. But the typical use for header parameters are API key value pairs or username authentication. During this lesson, we have looked at the structure of query, URI, and header parameters in relation to MuleSoft. The key points to remember, they all use key value pair format. Where query strings include a key value pair, a URI parameter uses the value for a known key position within the URI, and headers use key value pairs within the header section of a HTTP request. All can be accessed using the attributes tag along with the parameter type and the key name. That concludes our lesson on MuleSoft Parameters Basics, covering URI, query, and header methods. Enjoy your training, support your fellow squad members, and look forward to seeing you out in the field. Good luck all.